Hi everyone, this is video number 7 in my current series on how to plan your washes and manage your edges in a watercolour landscape painting. In this video I'm going to deal with the right hand side of the painting, the riverbank where the jetties are, where the boats are moored and their reflections in the river. Now it's an area of considerable complexity, and in order to paint this I'm going to need to simplify the subject quite considerably. Even so, as I paint this you will see that there is still a huge amount of detail, and yes, perhaps I could simplify it a little bit more. I don't know, we won't really know until we get to the end of the painting, but hopefully I'll judge it about right. I don't want to oversimplify it because that detail there is important to me. It characterises this bend in the River Arun where you've got all the little boats and the jetties, and I just love that detail and the way it's catching the light, and some of it's also in shade. It helps to make the picture. So I don't want to oversimplify it, but by the same token I don't want to cram in every last piece of detail either, so I've got to be careful with that. You'll notice that as I paint, most of what I'm doing with regard to the jetties is negative painting. The colour and the sunlight that is catching the supports, the planks, the scaffolding poles, that's all been painted already. If you recall, I dropped in some warm sunlit colours earlier on as a wet on wet wash, and of course now that's all dried, I can work over the top and define those shapes, not by painting them, but painting what's around them, and that in turn helps to define them. Now also, as I go through this stage of the painting enters again into what I call an ugly phase. This often happens in paintings. Generally at the start, when you're putting on nice wet on wet washes, it looks wonderful, and then you start to make a few areas of development and definition and it all just starts to look a bit odd, and then it seems to settle down again and you bring the painting on, and then you get to a point just before you put the detail on at the end where it just doesn't look quite right, because it looks like it's almost there but it's not quite finished. And I think we're going to get to the end of this video and it's going to be in an ugly phase where it won't quite be sitting right, and I will need to apply some details in the final video to finish it off. But hey, let's see how it goes. Let's get started with the painting. Okay, well let's get started. I've got a few colours mixed up here on the palette, so I'm all good to go. The same colours that I've been using throughout the painting, so I've got different mixes in here of yellow ochre or raw sienna, some cobalt blue, some ultramarine. I've got some burnt sienna, some warm sepia. Now I'm going to start off in this area here, and part of the reason for that is because there's an obvious break here. You can see the sunlight on this particular gate, if you like, or the end of this jetty here. So I'm just going to work to the left hand side of that and get that done first before moving on to this larger section on the right hand side. Now I'm going to start off with a bit of clear water here just at the top of these grasses, because I want to paint this sunlit colour into there. Should have cleaned my brush out first, but never mind. And just run up to the top of that. But as you can see, it's soon into shade, and so I'm going to change up and use this darker green colour . And I'm not going to leave all of these little poles here unpainted, because some of them are quite fine and it may be easier for me to just put those in with a little bit of titanium white in due course. And you can see here there's actually quite a lot of scaffold poles and bits and pieces, so let's just put those in later. I'm going to mix up the colour here and add in some blue because it is getting darker and more shadowy as we come down out of the sunlight. But we definitely want to leave this plank here that is the main support for the jetty, so let's keep that well clear of this paint. Now this is an important part of simplification. As I'm coming down into this area here, I can't really see exactly what it is I'm painting. Is it bank? Is it supports? Is there another little boat in there? And this is a golden rule for simplification. If you're not quite sure what it is, then don't keep looking. Just paint what you see. If you just don't quite know, then it's time to simplify. That's a golden rule, if you like, of simplification for me. Don't spend a lot of energy trying to work out what something is if you can't see it. Just paint what you see, however abstract that shape might be. And it's something you need to simplify. There's another little pole that just comes out there. And then we're down into this darker area of mud and exposed riverbank here. That just joins up into that area there. Now, when you're painting negatively like this, it's good to connect these areas that you've painted with some marks just to unify them. They're in the background, yes, for sure, but you don't want to make it look like you've just filled in gaps. So get something like a dark and just drop it in, let's say on the top one here, but then carry it down through here and then keep it coming. And what you've done is you've then unified those three shapes with that darker abstract. Well, let's just call it a splodge because that's all it is. But it's unified those three areas and tied them all in together, which works quite nicely. And you can do this in various places. Don't be too obvious about it and don't do too much of it. Now, while this part of the riverbank is wet here, there's no reason at all why I can't just connect in these posts. And it's nice that they're running in and connecting with the bank there. It's all the same tone. There's no need for lots of separate edges there to be clashing with each other. That's an opportunity for you to be losing edges there. In fact, this is probably a bit too busy, so I'm just going to close that space up, I think. That looks better. Now, if you recall, I said that I would paint the top of this awning on the boat here so that it connects in with the dark bank on top of it, because they're very similar in tone, albeit a different hue, and I wanted to lose that edge, so I can just paint the two next to each other. And if you recall, this is what I call painting wet to wet. It can be tricky sometimes to get the timing right, but I just want the blue there to merge into that dark riverbank, and that's working quite nicely. So I'm happy with the way that's turning out. You can see that it's a bit paler across the back of the boat here. Where the light's just catching it through there. And I'm happy with that. I've got the riverbank, I've got the awning, they're painted together. You can clearly see the difference between the two because of their colour. But because tonally they're very similar, I want to keep that free from a hard edge. I don't need it. I've got hard edges everywhere here. So where I can find an opportunity to lose one, I'll take it. And then just as that's drying up, I'm just going to put a little dark across the top there, just to give it a hint of definition. No more than that. And there we are. That's now sitting nicely into the riverbank. I've just dropped a few more darks in there. It really is quite dark through there. In fact, while that's still wet, let's get a very sticky mix of ultramarine, warm sepia, and just run that through there. I'm going to bring a couple of supports down. They're damp, but they're going to hold their place, but it's a soft edge as opposed to a hard one. And I like that. This one here, you can see right there, it's going to be a hard edge. It just runs out into a soft edge in this darkness and this shade that's underneath the jetty here. We've got a few more darks that are running down here, so let's suggest those, more poles and supports. And rather like when I paint trees, I'm getting to a point when I'm looking at this area that I'm starting to see what the painting needs more than just slavishly copying every single support that's there. Okay, same again on this side. So a little bit of water. Crystal clear water this must be, just so that we can get a nice soft transition without going up to this edge and interfering with it, because it's a nice shape. We'll get some more colour in here. Let's get some of this nice orangey colour on the grass. Rather like that. And then mix that up with some of this green. I'm just getting the sunlit colours in at this point, and you can see I'm painting nice and wet here, so I can come back to this and I can keep working it if I need to, and I will need to. It's important that even when you're painting sort of detailed, complex areas like this, that you are using enough wet paint, because if you're not, this whole passage then starts to look a little bit scrubby. Now you can see that as I'm coming down the paper here, I'm getting darker in tone because there's less sunlight the further we go down the bank towards the river. Back into some sunlit colour here. But again, we're quickly into shade. Okay, now I'm going to start putting in some other colour. As I said previously, if you can do this, it's an opportunity for you to tie different areas together. Now you can see that it is getting quite dark down here, but it's not as dark as it is in the photograph. And part of the reason for that is that I'm painting in watercolour. And yes, you can paint very, very dark if you want in watercolour. And often there is a time and a place and passages in a painting where that is important. However, for me, watercolour is a delicate medium and it requires a light touch with regard to the application of colour and tone. And so while it's darker, I don't want to obliterate this with incredibly heavy darks that are going to be very, very vivid next to some of these brighter poles and stanchions on the jetty. And some of those will be darkened down in due course as well, but just keep that in mind. It's watercolour. Keep it delicate. Keep it fresh. Get a bright green in there. Some of that orange actually, that's nice. And it's all getting darker as we come down the bank. Now I just want to draw your attention to a video that I made back in 2023. It was just before Christmas 2023, and it was called something like, "Is this the best ever watercolour exercise?" or something like that. I've put a link to it here. And it's basically a practice doodle that I do, where as well as understanding what happens to watercolour in terms of timing and when you put it on the paper, one thing that it does is it helps to improve your brush strokes and your brush control. And that's what I'm doing here. I am able to paint with precision and put these shapes where I want because I practice it. If you haven't practiced painting like this before, you are going to find this pretty challenging. And that's because it's not an instruction-based activity that I'm doing here. It is based on motor skills, feel, and touch. And it's something that you can practice. So please don't look at this and think, there's just no way I'd be able to paint like that. It's too fiddly, it's too complicated. Well, you're right. If you don't practice painting like this, then it will be very difficult. The more you practice painting in this way, the more easy it becomes. Okay, so that area is dry. Now I'm going to work on the bottom of the riverbank and that little exposed bit of mud where that comes down to the river itself. Now I'm going to do a similar thing here, which is to paint around these supports that are resting on the bank and into the river. Don't worry about the fact that the tonal contrast may look quite severe at this stage, because I will darken these posts in areas before putting on the reflections. So let's get started. More of the same colours going in here. I must be careful not to come down too far, otherwise I'm going to run into that muddy area that I want to show at the bottom of the bank. Now that actually is a lot lighter in there, so I'm going to just get rid of that. That can be a bit of underneath texture if you like, that would be fine. But it really is quite dark in here. Keep making sure that that's wet so that you can keep working with it. That's important. I'm then just going to drop in some of this very dark green. It's just underneath the walkway here. Let that run out. And I'm just letting this dirty brown colour for the bottom of the riverbank run up into the grassy area. Again, I don't need this to be a hard edge. It's quite well defined in the photograph itself, but I don't want it to be in the painting. I want this to be quite soft, quite minimal and understated. I don't want too much detail here. Now what I'm going to do, which may seem surprising, is get a brush full of water and just pull all this down the paper. I'm just catching the bottom edge of it and letting it run out, because I want this to be a soft edge so that I can start to paint those dark reflections in another wash. With reflections, I much prefer to paint what is being reflected first, establish that, and then you can come on at a later stage to put the reflections in. It just makes things a lot easier, as you're not having to match up something on the top with what you've already painted in terms of reflections, because often the reflections are too complicated if you've painted them first. So paint your reflecting objects, get those in, and then you can worry about the reflections in due course. And we'll just paint all that out there and let that soften off. Now what I can do is just fine-tune some of these areas that I've skirted around just to get this whole area painted quickly. I could do this at a later stage because it's detail. But to be honest, I've got the colours already mixed up on the palette, so I may as well just continue using them. If through here, for example, let's do a bit more negative painting to suggest some of these supports. And these are simply gaps in the slats in this gate or fence here. So just a few. I can see there's one through there as well. I can tighten up on this type of detail in due course, but for the time being, it doesn't hurt to put some of this in. I'm looking at the reference photo, but I'm also imagining at the same time. And as I have said before, I'm seeing what the painting needs. I'm going to let that all dry, and then I'm going to deal with some of these abrupt finishes to the posts here. And I'll show you what I mean by that. It's connected to how I'm going to deal with the reflections. It's a similar technique, and I'll show you what I'm going to do there. But for the moment, you can see they've dried as crisp, hard edges. I don't want them to ultimately be like that, but in order to manage this whole wash, I had to make those crisp at this stage, knowing that I can come back and soften them later. And I will do that as soon as that's all dry. Well, now this is all dried, what I've started to do is soften off the bottom of some of these poles, and it just helps them to lose a little bit of definition in this darkness and shadow that's going on underneath the jetties. And to do that, you need clear water and a synthetic brush, and I just brush on a little bit of water around the bottom of the poles, and then just drag it down with a bit of kitchen paper. Now I'm going to be glazing over this area and making it darker, which will help to push it back further, because at the moment you can see it's quite vivid. The tonal contrasts, certainly under the jetty, are quite strong. We need them on the top here, but not so much here, but we still want to have that definition between light and dark. We just don't need it to be quite as obvious as it is. But I still want hard edges to be evident, and that is why I've painted it in this way. Let's finish off this one here as well. Just a bit of water, paint it on, drag it down. You don't want to do too much of this, but it is a useful technique to have in your locker to help you lose some edges where it's maybe not quite so easy to manage them. Now, looking back over this area here, I noticed that I'd forgotten to soften the top of this little area of sunlit grass that I put in, and so you can see I've got a hard edge that has developed along here. Now I could just leave it and go, well, do you know what, it's so busy here, no one's really going to pay any attention to that. But it bothers me. I'm just that type of painter, I'm afraid. And so I can do the same thing here with this line. Just get a damp brush and paint along that line, drag down in a few places, and there you are. That's a much better outcome as far as I'm concerned. Now, before I put a glaze under this area, I'm going to put in the dark water that is the reflected bank. And I'm going to do the opposite of what I've done here. At the start of the reflections for each support, or the ones that I choose to pick out, I'm going to paint around those and leave a hard edge. But as they come closer to the foreground, you'll see that they become less well defined, they become softer, and then I can use a similar technique just to soften as we come down towards the edge of the paper here. Now the key aim with painting the water here is to get it right first time. There's very little we can do if it's not quite right. Yes, there's going to be a glaze that goes over this whole area eventually, but at this point I want to make sure it's dark enough so that it registers an edge against the bottom of the bank. But I want to make sure that it is not too busy. I don't want to have the same amount of information and edges that I've explained here showing in the water. It will just look far too busy, and this is where it becomes important to simplify. Just pick out a few edges that you think work well in the painting. Try not to show absolutely everything, or it just becomes too overwhelming for the eye. Right, let's paint the area of water here, and I'm just going to go around that pole there and then come back this way, and like I said, I'm just going to let that disappear. Comes up the bank here, around that pole which will be reflected down there, like so. It's important to be painting very wet here. Now I'm getting rid of these reflections really. I don't need them anymore because I can lift these out as I come closer to the bottom edge of the paper. And I'm not too worried about what's going on over here because I'm going to deal with this a little bit later. So I can just paint some clear water into there and get rid of that. Now I need some brown for the river as it comes through here, just where it's not quite as dark, a little bit more sunlit. Now I do want to put some strong darks just at the top of the water here. It's particularly dark in here. Drop that in while it's still all wet, let that run together. Reflections run down, so this is the dark bank running down towards us. I'm not painting any ripples at this point, so there's no horizontal shapes that are being put on here. That's quite deliberate. And all I really want to do at this stage is just define the bank, where the water meets it. This, like I said, will be glazed over in due course. And I will start to soften some parts of this once it's all dried. Okay, I don't want to do any more to it at this stage. I just want that all to dry up before I do any more work on this area. Okay, so with that all dry, I have lifted out some areas just to suggest the reflections of the main supports. Even though this is complex, even though there's an awful lot going on here, it is still hugely simplified relative to the scene itself when you look at the number of poles and planks and supports and things going on here. But I'm going to knock this back further because at this stage it's way too bright and we just need to subdue it with a glaze. And what I'm going to do is start at the top, work my way down, changing the colour where I need to in various places, leaving some areas unpainted just so that there's some highlights just showing through. And then that will help to just calm this area down. So what I'm going to do is just paint clear water along here just to paint into. And then take my shadow colour and drop this in, particularly here. I'm just going to leave that there, like so. There's a mucky green that runs down here into the base of these supports, where of course they are in water at high tide, and you know they're covered in algae and all that sort of thing. So as I've mentioned before, when glazing, be very delicate with how you apply the paint. Make sure that it's going on nice and softly, lots of fluid. That's very important. Now it's quite mucky down at the bottom of these steps here. Now as I bring the glaze down, I'm going to change up into this lovely warm colour, which will help to accentuate the highlights that are just showing through here. And it's very subtle. It's not an obvious effect that I'm looking for, but it's just enough to calm this whole area down. Clear water just finishes it off on this side. As I mentioned previously, I'm going to put a nice crisp bit of reflection around here. I'm also going to reflect some of the posts crisply as well. Not too many, but I'm going to leave that as it is now, because that has done wonders in just knocking everything back. Because with the painting as it stands at the moment, it's at what is called the ugly stage. So things are not quite finished off. In fact, areas like this have got quite a bit more work required to give them definition. But you can see how things are coming together. And the important thing is to trust the process. And the process is to manage the edges by planning your washes. Okay, let's put some of these darks in around the boat here. And yeah, let's just get a little bit of clear water in here. So I'm starting off with a soft edge on the top. But I want to drop in some of these darker supports that are here. There's one just coming down here. I think one in there too. And then it all just gets rather dark in here. I'm going to pick out the edge of the ladder there. I quite like that as a feature. But the rest is just very dark in here. It's quite nice. It's going to give some nice definition to this boat here. So come down carefully around the edge of this boat. It's still very dark in here. And then I'm going to get some more clear water and just paint some on here, because I want this to ultimately all fade out on this side here. So I want to paint into this wet area so that I've got a soft edge over here. And then that allows me to continue working across to the boat. We come down this side, and now that I have come into the area of water, I'm just going to vary the brush stroke slightly, because we're going to have a suggestion of ripples here. Just defining the back of the boat. And as you can see, this post here is reflecting as well, so we'll put that in. And then I'm just going to fade that out with the damp brush, and that gives a nice effect to that. I'm going to come in here now with some clear water again and allow this to come down the paper into this area here. It's sunlit, or reflecting the sunlight on the fence above, I should say. And then just continue to put in some reflections on this side. Now I still think we could go darker in here. So let's put some really strong darks in. This is almost concentrated colour of ultramarine and burnt sepia, but it's going to give us this lovely dark effect here underneath those jetties and next to the boat where the sun's not able to penetrate through at all. Now while I've got some colour mixed up here, I'm just going to suggest a few more foreground ripples here, not too much. It's just enough to give a sense that there's some movement on the water and to make sense of the ripples that we've got around the edge of the boat there. It's quite a nice effect. Now this is damp here, and what I'm hoping is that I can just paint a couple of dark reflections down here. Without them being too obvious. There's just going to be enough dampness in the paper to let them fuzz out a bit, which there is. I'm quite pleased with that. Now I don't just want this suggestion of ripples out here, I also want some movement across here as well. So I'm going to pick out one or two just in this area here. I'm not 100% sure if this is the right thing to do, but sometimes you just need to take these risks. With watercolour, there's no going back really, you've just got to do it. It's not quite dry, so it's fuzzing out a little bit. That's all right, I'm not too bothered about that. It may just make it look way too busy, but I don't know, it's a tricky one. What I can do with my damp brush is just blend those through so that they're soft in places as well, which is actually quite a nice effect. I can see that I should have probably brought this dark area a little bit further down here, but to be honest, it's too late to really make any adjustments to that without creating runbacks and things like that. So that's going to have to stay as it is. Whether or not there's a way of fine-tuning that or not, I don't know. It's probably best just left alone. So I'm going to leave the painting as it is in its ugly phase. And like I said, it's important to understand that these phases happen throughout your painting. And what you need to be able to do is to be able to look past them. And you can only do that if you have a process, a method, a strategy, whatever you want to call it, that you're confident in and you know is going to work. For me, and I've mentioned this before in other videos, I have the 4 Ds: decisions, development, definition and detail, and I trust that structure to get me from start to finish. It means that at stages of the painting where I look at it and think, oh, it just really doesn't look right, or I'm not quite happy with this, or that needs a bit of extra work because it's not reading quite right, it's okay. I know where I'm going to be going. I'm trusting the process. And essentially that's what we're doing when we are planning our wash sequences and managing our edges. We're working to a structure and a process that's going to help us to get from A to Z in a way that gives us a painting at the end that we're happy with. So thanks ever so much for watching. If you've subscribed to the channel, thank you very much for doing that. If you haven't, perhaps you'd like to click on subscribe, click the bell icon too, and you'll receive a notification each time I release a new video. Of course, if you've enjoyed this video, please click on the thumbs up like button. That always helps the channel. So that's it for now. Thanks ever so much for watching. In the meantime, enjoy your painting. I'll see you next time.